Greetings and Afade, everyone. My name is Zachary Quiogue, and I will be giving you all an overview of the non-brown tree snake species encountered on Cocos Island. I'd like to first provide you all with an overview of my presentation. I'll start off with an introduction, including why Cocos Island is significant and some information on the USGS rapid response effort on the island. Next, I will go over the methods we are using, mainly visual surveys and what we do for tallying prey data. An explanation of the data will be provided through our preliminary findings. We will be taking a look at BTS sightings and prey counts, and also the catch per unit effort or CPUE of each non-BTS species category. We'll end off with some inferences to determine what our preliminary findings mean for the situation on Cocos Island. Just to remind you all about what's happening on Cocos, we'll start off from the beginning with a snake shed found on the island back in January 2020. In conjunction with Guam's Department of Agriculture, Division of Aquatic and Wildlife Resources, or DAR, the USGS Rapid Response Team was deployed and traps were set up on the island to be regularly checked for any captures. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the effort was halted. In September 2020, the Rapid Response Team coordinator at the time, Mr. Patrick Barnhart, he received reports from DAR personnel that local fishermen had actually spotted some BTS on Cocos. Interviews were performed and the decision was made to deploy the BTS Rapid Response Team. An initial response effort began on October 21st, 2020, and a snake was actually discovered that same first night. With the detection of snakes, initial plans changed to plans for a multi-agency effort to eradicate snakes from Cocos Island. Currently, efforts are being made by the government of Guam to secure federal technical assistance and funding towards the eradication of snakes from Cocos Island with resolution number 9436. While this is in the works, we, the USGS Rapid Response Team, are creating a baseline data set that may be useful for monitoring the status of BTS on Cocos and if the population there has achieved densities that exceed its carrying capacity. You might be asking, why is it important that we put forth all this effort for eradicating snakes from Cocos? Well, the reason is because Cocos Island plays a significant role for many species that used to occur on Guam, but have unfortunately either disappeared from Guam or become patchy in their distribution. Here we have a list of birds that are uncommon to see on Guam, but we often see on Cocos. We have the Pacific reef heron, the Micronesian starling, brown and black noddies, and white terns. For the Micronesian starling, there's a population on Anderson, but there's also a population on Cocos. For the white tern, I have it on this list because it was included in a survey done by Fritz in 1988, but personally, I believe that they're becoming a bit more common to see compared to the other birds on this list. Here's a list of lizards that are uncommon on Guam, but we find on Cocos. We have Amoya cyanura, Amoya sleveni, Amoya atricostata, there's Pyrrhachirus, and there's Gera oceanica. For Amoya sleveni, it's actually extirpated on Guam, and it's considered critically endangered, meaning that the small population that's found on Cocos is at a high risk because of the introduction of BTS on the island. Other threatened and endangered species that can be found on Cocos include the green sea turtle or the hagen, the Guam rail or known as the coco, and the Mariana fruit bat, also known as the finihi. During the rapid response effort, our teams have actually encountered these species while conducting visual surveys or during our trapping efforts. We try our best to avoid any possible interactions with any T&E species, but because we are under a emergency consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, these interactions are permissible as long as we properly report, and follow all procedures that are stated in the agreement that we made. For a brief general public service announcement, I'd like to let you all know that although Cocos is very beautiful and has amazing wildlife, your presence on the island actually can threaten the livelihood of many of these species just as much as the brown tree snake, so just letting you know. But to continue on, there are other species that can be found on Cocos that are actually found on Guam as well. To name a few, we have the cane toad, some hermit crabs, green anoles, the yellow bittern, the Pacific blue-tailed skink, and the mangrove monitor lizard. As for the specifics on what we do while on Cocos Island, since the start of the response, the USGS Rapid Response Team has been conducting nocturnal visual surveys for brown tree snakes. Visual surveys on Cocos Island involve trained searchers walking along maintained transects for about 4 hours a night in order to find and remove BTS. Throughout the effort, we have had a total of 13 unique observers record data digitally and have surveyed a total of about 221 kilometers. On the left, you can see a map of our transects, and we have transects covering most of the island from the northeast to the southwestern end. While conducting visual surveys, potential prey items and non-BTS species are tallied and recording using a data collection app on electronic tablets. Each species has its own code, and in the app, they are separated into 8 different categories, including bird, skink, gecko, anole, frog, toad, and crab and monitor lizard. For our preliminary findings, we'll go back to the map of Cocos, and if you reference the legend, blue is for the resort path transect, yellow is the coast transect, light green, the Rockwell transect, pink, the road transect, and orange is the roost transect, where we see many of the seabirds nesting and roosting. Just to go over the stats on BTS again, in total we have sighted 55 snakes on the island. And if you reference the table below, you can see counts of each non-BTS species that we have encountered and tallied throughout our surveys on Cocos Island. Many of the geckos and anoles can be found on the road and roost transects, where we haven't actually sighted too many snakes in those areas. This could either mean that the population density for BTS is low in those areas, or maybe we just have a low detection rate due to how complex the habitat is with thick vegetation. To continue on our preliminary findings, this figure shows the catch per unit effort of each non-brown tree snake species that we have encountered and tallied throughout our surveys on Cocos. We have a good amount of gecko and anoles. For skinks, since many of them are diurnal, meaning that they're active during the day, we usually don't see them unless we accidentally disturb them. And the same can be said for monitor lizards. We don't usually see them during our night surveys unless we catch them sleeping in a log or maybe in some shrubbery. There is still a high abundance of birds on Cocos, and many birds that we encounter during our visual surveys are brown and black noddies, the island collar dove, and white terns. This data corresponds to what was collected by T.H. Fritz that suggests that Cocos still persists to be a safe haven for many of these species to survive from BTS predation. And to look at this graph closely, specifically the green anole section, there is a high CPUE, and they're considered highly abundant on Cocos. This is a very interesting fact because green anoles were the first lizards to disappear after snakes reached northern Guam in the 1980s and appear to be highly vulnerable to BTS predation. And to compare this data, we looked at data we collected from Guam. It is comparing non-BTS CPUE on Guam versus Cocos Island. And it was collected at our closed population study in Anderson, and it has a brown tree snake population that is constantly monitored for any changes. Looking at this graph, it is very apparent that there is a difference in CPUE for bird, geckos, and anoles between Guam and Cocos. We've hardly detected any birds and anoles on Guam, and many of the geckos that we've seen on Guam are actually introduced species. Cocos is a different story with many native species for both bird and geckos still persisting there. As many of you know, Guam did once have a food web that was highly diverse, and it was able to sustain native forests. Here we can see some historic figures by Fritz and Rhoda that illustrate the stark difference in the vertebrate food web pre and post BTS introduction. With the introduction of BTS, there was now an apex predator on Guam that would predate upon all niches of the food web. And looking at that, I wanted to create an example of the vertebrate food web on Cocos Island. Arrows indicate trophic interactions between species, with solid arrow lines indicating BTS or oceanic gecko predation, and dashed arrows used for Guam rail predation. You can see that BTS is both a predator and a competitor of Coco with their shared diet of lizards. So it's very interesting because they share preference in hunting lizards, and there's kind of like a competition happening between them on Cocos. Another interesting fact is that there is a relatively diverse food web with many native species, and this may be occurring because the BTS population is still in its eruption phase on Cocos and is working towards being well established. So to bring this back full circle, if we use anoles as an indicator for the status of the BTS population on Cocos Island, their high abundance means that the BTS population is still in its eruption phase, meaning that there is still hope for Cocos, because if efforts are made towards the eradication of this population of BTS, then we can minimize the negative effects on bird and lizard species on Cocos and many of the other vulnerable species. With resolution number 9436 that was introduced to the Guam legislature, it's a very great start for this to happen and for us to continue working towards bringing Cocos back to being snake free. Thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. Thank you to Cocos Island Resort for continued cooperation and support. We appreciate the logistical contributions made by DAR, DOD, and SEMO, and our work was also made possible with the help of other cooperating agencies and individuals who have contributed a tremendous amount of work towards this effort. That is all for my presentation. Any questions?